This video is sponsored by Saal Digital.
This is the Sigma FPL. This is the teeny tiny full frame camera that could. You heard that right, this tiny little thing is full frame. Let me just show you how silly that looks in the best way possible. It's like 90% sensor. And what a sensor that is, seriously. This has many tricks up its sleeve and it's impressed me thoroughly in my testing over the last few weeks. So on top of the 61 megapixel camera, we also have phase detect autofocus in that little body. And I've had interesting results with that, which I shall go over in a bit, but on the whole, phase detect for the win. And you may have noticed that there is no EVF on this just because it's so blooming tiny. You can have an attachable EVF, so if that's something that is absolutely a deal breaker for you, there is a workaround. But for the purposes of my needs and my tiny camera series, I want to keep it as minimal as possible, so we're just going with screen only. So first of all, the size. I think the biggest selling point of this camera is obviously the size. It is record-breaking. It's the smallest full-frame camera in the world, and it's only 427 actual grams. For context, the tiny EM5 Mark I is 500 grams. So this full-frame camera is lighter than many portable cameras in my tiny camera series. And the Lumix GH6, which admittedly is not a tiny camera, but it's certainly a smaller censored camera, and it has a lot of cinema features that are similar, is almost twice the size and weight at 823 grams. The Sigma is super duper dinky. And you may think that there are some compromises with this, and maybe there are. You don't have an articulating screen, for instance. I think despite the boxy design, it is quite nice to hold in the hand due to the raised thumb grip at the back. I didn't find it bad in the hand at all. I found it quite pleasant to use. So let's talk about lenses. You can have the tiniest blooming camera in the world, but if the lenses that go with it are massive, you're not going to get very far if you want a small setup. So I took it upon myself to try and find the smallest full frame lenses on the market. This is the TT Artisan's 50mm f2. Now it is a manual focus lens, but it's dirt cheap. It's like 70 quid. It's absolutely tiny and really sort of flush to the body. In fact, it's not much more of a footprint than the EM5 with the 17mm Olympus lens, which is what I use very often as my go-to kit. There are a lot of wonderful primes in the Sigma lineup that are tiny, very well built, great autofocus, and work really great on this system. So you will notice on this camera, we have a lovely tactile button here that goes from stills to cinema. So I'm going to split this review in two, and we're going to start with stills. On the photography side of this camera, there is a lot to love. The Sigma menu is so nice. It's so streamlined, so easy to navigate. You just use the dial on the front to go through the menu, and the quick menu you can customize to your taste, and I've found it intuitive to use. In low light, this camera is incredible. It's as good, if not better, than the Lumix counterparts, and that is just to say that you can shoot basically at any ISO you want, and it's always going to look awesome. If you want a cheat sheet for photography, get an L-mount camera because the low light performance is stupid. So my very favorite feature about this camera is how it utilizes the 61 megapixel sensor, and that gives us crop mode. We can have a ball with prime lenses on this camera. So the lenses that I chose, the smallest ones, we had the Sigma 17mm and the TT Artisan's 50mm. And you may have thought that's not very versatile, Emily. 17mm is kind of a weird focal length. Well, with crop mode, we can get a ton of use cases out of these two lenses. And genuinely, you don't lose any quality. I'm just going to refer to my notes because there's lots of numbers in this bit and I want to get it right. At 1.5 crop, we have 26 megapixels to work with, and that means you get more megapixels in cropped mode with the Sigma than you do out of the camera natively from the GH6 or from the S5 Mark II. So the crop mode is legit, really legit. And then 2 times crop, which turns the 17mm lens into a conventional 34mm, gives you 15 megapixels, which, as long as you get your framing right, is more than enough. You can still blow a 15 megapixel photo up massive. It may give you less versatility in editing, but it's certainly usable. So that's a 2x crop. So the 50mm lens would become a 100mm lens, the 17 would become 35, and suddenly you can see that you can get a lot out of a little kit with the Sigma camera. And then you can go to the extremes. The 2.5 crop at 9 megapixels and a 5x crop at full HD quality. So you would only use those in cases where you absolutely had to, but it's a good option to have. I'm suddenly coming around to the idea of bigger sensors. I've always thought they were quite gimmicky, to be honest, but yeah, the 61 megapixel sensor in this has a lot of use cases. The second best feature in the photography realm of this camera is color bracketing. This is something that's very popular on the Fujifilm cameras with sort of film emulation and stuff. And you do have something quite similar in this camera. We have 15 different color profiles in this Sigma camera to choose from. We have cinema mode and we have monochrome, which is lovely. And we have a lot of different color variations as well. One of my personal favorites is powder blue. And with bracketing mode, which you can turn on and off very quickly, you can cycle through 5 different variations shooting at 61 megapixel JPEGs straight into camera, ready to rock. You can get a lot of intriguing results very quickly with literally one click of a button. Now there are 2 things I like much less. First of all, and it's a biggie to be honest, there is no IBIS built into this camera. There is an electronic stabilization mode which does punch in slightly, and with the megapixels in the camera, that's not the end of the world, but it's not quite as good as actual IBIS. The thing that is annoying about this is stabilized lenses are blooming massive. So if you want to keep the kit small, one of the sacrifices is you will not have IBIS. You can still use the camera with higher shutter speeds handheld, no problem. You've got tripods, you've got gimbals, there are options, but yeah, no IBIS, bit of a bummer. But I have found with the lenses that I'm using, if I keep my minimum shutter speed at 1/100th of a second, there's no blur, there's no bother whatsoever. And a lot of my tiny camera series doesn't have IBIS. I'm quite used to shooting photography without IBIS. It really only comes into play if you need the lower shutter speed, which is either, to be fair, to let more light in, which you don't need to do at all with this camera because you can use whatever ISO you fancy, or to get the longer shutter speeds handheld, which is a very niche use case anyway. The second thing I like less is a bigger deal, and that is it's an electronic only shutter. There's no mechanical shutter. Now, this enables us to get really fast shutter speeds, and that's great, but one thing that you can run into is issues with banding in lights that are electronic. Sometimes you can get away with it, sometimes you can't. It's just something that you need to be aware of and need to manage. The way that you get around this is by syncing your shutter speed to the electricity. So in the UK we have 50 hertz. So if we shoot 50th of a second, 100th of a second, 200th of a second most of the time works too, then you don't get the banding. So it's something to be aware of. Most tiny cameras, and certainly basically all mirrorless cameras, do switch to electronic shutter at a certain point, but it's usually sort of over 500th of a second or whatever. This does it all the way through the range. The banding thing can be an issue, so just keep that in mind. Let's talk about cinema mode. The cinema mode is tremendous. It is a true pocket cinema camera, and there's so much to love about the video features. Cinema DNG is in the Sigma camera. You can shoot 8-bit internally and 12-bit if you record to an external SSD. Cinema DNG, if you don't know, means that every single frame of that video, so 24 frames a second or 30 frames a second, whatever you're shooting, each individual frame is a blooming RAW file. So that means we no longer have to faff with vlog profiles to get the most out of it. It should, in theory, be as push and pullable as a raw photo file in video. The color grading options with this camera seem to be literally limitless. The one downside of Cinema DNG is because every single frame is a raw file. Around 100 gigabytes of internal storage will give you about 17 minutes of footage. So maybe the SSD recording is probably beneficial either way, so you can get the 12-bit and also more storage to deal with. Cinema DNG is not something I would record a talking head bit with. It's not something I would record anything lengthy with, but if you're looking for that hero shot, or if you're in particularly tricky lighting situations, or you want to do some really heavy color grading, I think it really does have its place, and it's very, very cool. Because we do have access to Cinema DNG, there is no Vlog profile. I wish that it was included, because if you want to shoot in MOV profile, the Vlog may have come in handy, so you can get a little bit more dynamic range out of the footage. But the Cinema profile, which is probably the most similar to Cinelike D in other cameras, is very, very good.
This video is sponsored by Saal Digital.
This is a perfect example of ya buy cheap, ya buy twice. Here is one of my favourite photographs, and I got this from, I can't even remember where I bought it from, it was not Saal Digital. I have been a little bit of a cheapskate in the past when it comes to my printing, and I have since learnt the errors of my ways. I shot this in 2019 at Monument Valley. That print is pants. There's waves, it isn't mounted correctly, the colours aren't punchy. I thought I owed it to myself and to photography to get a proper one done. And I got this version, this professional gallery print from Saal Digital. And oh my God, it's beautiful. Isn't he beautiful? It's night and day as to how much better this print is. Every time I see that big print on my wall in place of the janky one, it makes me smile. Please check out Saal Digital using the links below. It really does help the channel, and you are getting some fantastic products as well. So, what I love about the video aspect of the Sigma FPL, that crop mode on that delicious sensor also works in video mode, which is perhaps even more useful. Let me just get my notes again so I don't screw up. You can have up to 2.5 times crop and still be in 4K without any loss of resolution. 2.5 times? That makes your lenses so versatile, and there is no loss in quality. I also love that you have one button false color. So if you want to check that your skin tones are correctly exposed, false color can be really handy because it shows you the hot points and the dark points of the image. Things I don't love. The AF, despite it being phase detect autofocus, does seem to pulse a little bit in video mode. It's cracking in photo mode, less reliable in video mode. Despite it being phase detect, the focus wasn't as good as I was expecting. Certainly not as good as the Lumix cameras, which I'm using right now, which it just works. It blows me away every single blooming day I use these cameras. The autofocus is stunning, and the Sigma is not quite as good, unfortunately, but still a hell of a lot better than a lot of contrast-based alternatives. So what do I think? I think if you are looking for a small full-frame camera, like if sensor size and shallow depth of field is something that you really value, this is the smallest one in the world. We're at a stage now in the L mount lineup where you can have very small, wonderful lenses, but also have the versatility of putting larger lenses on and using it rigged up as a cinema camera or nice and minimal for your everyday carry. What a time to be alive. This camera literally fits in my smallest handbag. I'm going out with a full frame camera in my tiny bag. Like, it's stupid. With these lens choices, you can make a very small kit. I think if you already are invested in the L mount system, so maybe you have an S1 or an S5 or an S5 Mark II, if you want a smaller camera body that shares all of the lenses, this would be a great addition to your kit. I just think there's a lot to love. There's a lot of innovation. When I got to grips with this camera and started to learn more about it, I didn't understand why more people on YouTube weren't singing about it from the rooftops, because it does have a lot of unique, innovative features. This is not the cheapest setup in the world by a long shot, but it is full frame, and it's as small as you can get in the full frame arena. Did this impress you, or do you think it's probably overkill for an everyday carry? What do you think? Let me know in the comments. And check out these videos here for some more full frame goodness, or check out my tiny camera series playlist for more everyday carry cameras.